welcome to Pictorial Planet. My name's John Finch. This week we continue our deep dive into FX55 Developer. In part 2 we're going to be looking at what kind of ISO we get with that developer and the FP4 Plus combination. It's going to be interesting for me, and I expect maybe a third of a stop, maybe 2/3 at a stretch. But let's see, let's get outside and find out what Crawley gave us in that fantastic developer. So before we carry on, I want to just talk about what we're trying to achieve here. I have a developer, FX55, and I have a film, in this case FP4 Plus. And I want to know what performance FP4 Plus gives me with my developer FX55. Now, performance can be seen in many different ways. So I'm talking about, in this case, the ISO performance of the film. What actual ISO am I achieving with FX55 Developer with this particular film? Why do I want to know that? Well, of course, it's all about exposure. If I can expose my negatives accurately, there'll be much better negatives to work with, and my photographs, my prints, will be much better prints at the end of the day. So that's what I'm trying to achieve with this test. Now, I recommend to everybody to do this test with their favorite developer and film combinations, so they really understand the ISO of their film and they can set it correctly on their meters and improve their negatives no end. So this is how the test goes. First of all, I went out with my camera and I took a photograph, a regular photograph exposed properly, as close as I could. I used box speed for that photograph. I then put the lens cap on the camera and covered it up with my hand, and I took another photograph. That gives me a negative of what we call film base plus fog, basically a completely unexposed piece of film. I use that in my testing later. I then took another regular photograph so that I've sandwiched this blank negative between two regular negatives. It's easy for me to find then on the roll. I've now set my camera up on the tripod with the same film in. Just finished taking those initial shots now. And I've put it in front of a blank wall or board or something that I have. Now, my particular board is a kind of a light grey colour, but most kind of mid-toned colours work quite well for this testing. You can even use the wall of your house as long as it's fairly smooth like this. I've completely filled the frame with this, and I've focused on infinity so that there's no way any of this is going to be in focus. And I want that. I want just a blank negative that has captured this board. Now I take a meter reading of the board. Now I need this to be evenly lit. We don't want it lighter over here than over here, because then it'll be very hard for us to complete the test. We need to get as evenly lit as possible. So I'm in the shade here, which is helping to evenly light this surface. But you can also do this test outside on an overcast day, or even in full sunshine, as long as it's completely evenly lit. And we're going to test that right now. So I've got my light meter, and I'm going to use the spot meter, and I'm going to take a meter reading of each corner. And I've got 125 at f8, 125 f8, the same, and the same. So the whole board is giving me 125 at f8. That's at 200 ISO. Hey, wait a minute. 200 ISO? We said this was Ilford FP4, which is a box speed of 125. Well, the reason I've set 200 ISO up is because Crawley was very good at increasing film speed or getting real film speeds from films. And so the FX55 I'm hoping will give at least ISO 125 and maybe even a little bit higher. So in order to find that out, I need to assume that I'm getting higher and then work down from that until I hit the actual ISO of the film. So I've set 200 on my meter. Now, I'm going to be locking in this meter, this film, and FX55. If I used my camera meter to take these meter readings, then I'd be locking in my camera with the film with FX55. And that's fine if you've got just one camera. But if you've got more than one camera, you might want to use a handheld meter, because therefore this is locked in to my combination and I can use any camera with this handheld meter. All right, so continuing. I've set 125 at f8 on my camera, which is the meter reading of this surface. Meters read zone 5, medium grey. So that means if I take this photograph, this will be zone 5, medium grey negative. Unfortunately, in the darkroom, I can't tell that that's zone 5, medium grey. I need some way of telling exactly which zone my meter reading and my exposure of the photograph is giving me for this complete board here. So the way to do that is to dial down to zone 1. Zone 1 is just off black. So if I can take a photograph and prove that it's taking just off black negative, then I know what ISO that photograph was taken at. How do I do that? Well, I've got zone 5 now, 125 at f8 set on my camera, and I'm going to reduce the exposure by 4 stops. So first of all, from 125, I'm going to move it up to 250 to 500. So now I've reduced the exposure by 2 stops, 125 to 500. And I'm going to take my lens and move it from f8 to f16. That's 2 more stops. So I've reduced my exposure by 4 stops, from zone 5 to zone 1. I'm now going to take a photograph. That was a zone 1 photograph at ISO 200. I'm now going to open my lens up half a stop, so from f16 to halfway between f11 and f16. Now, if your camera doesn't have click stops at the halfway point on the lens, just guesstimate halfway between f16 and f11 and take another shot. I'm going to open it up another half stop. So now we're at f11. And again, half a stop. Halfway between f8 and f11. And finally, f8. Those negatives are going to be calculated in the darkroom to work out which ISO I'm actually getting with this film. We're going to go in the darkroom now and we're going to have a look at how that works. I've processed the film, and here you can see the test negatives that I just took outside. The rest of the roll I just took pictures, regular pictures, using 125 ISO as box speed to get the rough exposure correct. So as we can see at the beginning, I took a regular photograph, my completely blank film base plus fog negative, and then another photograph to sandwich that between the two. That makes it much easier for me to find. After this last regular photograph there, I can then start my testing, and you can see the exposure slowly increasing by that half stop each time I took a shot. And this one here is the first one, which is basically at ISO 200. It's theoretically zone 1, but we don't know that, and so we're going to test that. And then we'll test this and this until we find out which one of these increasingly dense negatives gives us the zone 1, and that will show us the ISO that we're achieving. So let's get on the enlarger and let's start doing this, and I'll show you how we do this now. So for this test, I'm going to be using my paper of choice, which is Ilford multigrade fibre based. It's the glossy that I like to use. I like the tonality of that particular paper. But that doesn't matter. You must use the paper that you use all the time for this test. It'll help lock in the paper as well to this whole this whole thing. I'm going to set my enlarger up, and I'm going to make a note of the height of the enlarger and the f-stop that I use of the enlarger. And because this is a Magnafx 4 enlarger with a color head, I'm going to also make a note of the density setting, because this is a variable density head on this enlarger, so that I can dial in more or less density and therefore change the exposure of my negative. So it's important that I keep the same settings on the enlarger, because later on I'm going to be testing for development time, and when I test for development time I'm going to have to use the exact same settings again on my enlarger as I used today to find the ISO of the film. So the first negative that I need to put into my enlarger is the completely blank negative that was taken between the two regular shots, film base plus fog. I'll put that one into the enlarger now and switch the lights back off. Now I've got that blank film base plus fog negative set up in the enlarger. I'm going to make sure I am closed down the enlarger sufficiently. I usually use 2 stops down from my wide setting in the enlarger. I've got the enlarger set to grade 2, the medium grade, and in this case my density is set on 10. Now on my timer I've set 3 seconds. So let's switch off that light there, and I'm going to cut a piece of paper. I now have a piece of test paper in the frame right in the middle of that test negative, film base plus fog. I've set my timer for 3 seconds, and I'm going to expose the whole test sheet for 3 seconds. I'm now going to cover up part of it and give it another 3 seconds. And again, and again, and again, and again, right across the test sheet. So I have multiple exposures increasing slowly across the test sheet by 3 seconds each increase. Let's develop that and see how it comes out. So here's the test strip, and as we can see, here's the differences in the 3-second exposures as I moved along the test strip. Now what we do is we count along until we can't see any difference anymore in these sections. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. When I get to 8, it's completely black. I can't see 9. There's no difference between 8 and 9. So that means 8 times 3 seconds gets me completely black from film base plus fog. Now it's important to make a note of that, 8 times 3 seconds. For those who watched an earlier video I did on D23, the number of changes was different, but then the height of the enlarger was different and so on. So don't take any notice of that. This is for this particular test using these conditions. 8 times 3 seconds reaches full black. Now we're going to use that information to find out the ISO of the film. So here are our test negatives again, and here is my film base plus fog, completely blank negative. And I know this took 8 times 3 seconds. So the next thing to do is for me to put this negative in here. This is the first one we took, which was 4 stops down from the meter reading at ISO 200. So this should theoretically, if the film gave 200 ISO, this would be zone 1. I'm going to put this one in and I'm going to expose it to a piece of paper, a small cut strip of paper, to 8 times 3 seconds without moving anything on the enlarger. Keep the enlarger exactly the same as it was for here. I'm going to expose the paper for 8 times 3 seconds with this negative. I'm going to cover up half of the test strip of paper and then I'll expose it for a length of time. I'm going to give it another 10 or 15 seconds. That will show me a completely black side of the paper, and the other side of the paper will be this negative exposed at 8 times 3 seconds. If I can see a difference between the two, I've found out the ISO of the film. So let's do that now with the enlarger. Okay, I'm going to get some paper out and I'm going to cut a very small piece. It's about 4 inches long by 1 inch wide. And I'm going to put it on this. I've got the negative all set up and I've got a piece of paper here. So now I'm going to expose this for 8 times 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now I'm going to cover up half of this and I'm going to give it a good long burst. I'll give it another 10 seconds. This is to ensure that one half of it is completely black, and that will help us tell the difference between the two halves if there is one. So here we go, we're giving it the full 10 seconds now. Great. Okay, let's develop that and see what we get. Well, I am surprised, but I can see a difference. And it's definitely discernible. It's just off black, just where I would have expected it. And I am surprised because I would have thought 200 ISO was too fast. But this looks okay. Now, I shouldn't look at it in a wet condition. I should dry this off first and make sure when it's dry, with the dry down that happens with paper, that there's still a difference. But it looks to me like we have 200 ISO with FX55 and FP4. Now, I couldn't believe it when I first saw it, so I did it again. I did a second test and it's definitely different. I hope you can see that. Yeah, look. Can you see the difference? It's just off black. Amazing. I'm going to dry this down and then we'll have another look at it. So I've brought this out into the daylight, hopefully so you can see this more clearly, but let's see, there. Can you see the difference? It's very subtle, but it's definitely there. There, can you see the difference? There's definitely a lighter side, light on the left, dark on the right, and it's very close to each other. That was my first test, so that shows 200 ISO is giving me around about zone 1. You know what? It might be even very slightly faster than that, maybe a third of a stop. Well, I can tell you I'm very surprised at the result I got today. I really did not expect 2/3 of a stop straight off the bat. In fact, I suspect I might be getting even more speed because the difference in the grey tone and the total black is more than I would have expected, slightly more. So between now and next week's video, I'll be doing a further test just to see if I get that extra third of a stop speed. That will push Ilford FP4, and that's the wrong word, I shouldn't use that. That will show FP4 is working at an ISO of 250 with FX55. Very impressive indeed. I'll be testing it before next week, and next week in part 3 of our deep dive into FX55 we're going to be looking at how long the development time should be for FP4. So there'll be a little more testing, but the results should be very interesting. All of these things are crucial to know about your film and developer combination, because only by doing these tests are you going to raise the quality of your negatives and really start making fine art material. So until next week, a big thank you to all my patrons who make this possible, and give me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you then.